The year is 1914. The world is on the brink. In just a few weeks, a single gunshot will ignite a war unlike any before, a conflict so vast, it would touch every continent and change humanity forever. This is the story of World War I, told in just 10 minutes. The 28th of June, 1914, marked a pivotal moment in history as Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie, were assassinated in Sarajevo. This act, carried out by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, was not an isolated incident but rather the culmination of simmering tensions and a complex web of alliances that had been developing across Europe for decades. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, already grappling with nationalist movements within its diverse territories, viewed the assassination as a direct affront and a clear indication of Serbian aggression. This immediate reaction set in motion a chain of diplomatic maneuvers, ultimatums, and mobilizations that quickly escalated beyond the control of individual nations. The assassination provided the spark, but the underlying causes, imperial rivalries, arms races, and the rigid alliance system, were the tinder that had been meticulously laid, waiting for just such an ignition. Within a month of the Archduke's death, what began as a regional dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia spiraled into a full-blown European conflict. Austria-Hungary, with the strong backing of Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, which was largely perceived as a pretext for war. Russia, bound by its alliance with Serbia, began to mobilize its forces, a move that Germany interpreted as an act of aggression against itself. This triggered Germany's own declaration of war on Russia and, subsequently, on France, due to the Franco-Russian alliance. Great Britain, initially hesitant, was drawn into the conflict following Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium, a violation of international treaties. The assassination of one man had, therefore, effectively unraveled the delicate balance of power in Europe, plunging the continent and, eventually, much of the world, into a devastating war that would fundamentally reshape the global landscape. In August 1914, millions of young men marched off to war, many believing they'd be home by Christmas. They weren't. The Great War, as it was then known, witnessed a revolution in military technology, fundamentally altering the nature of combat and leading to a scale of destruction previously unimaginable. The machine gun, a terrifyingly efficient weapon, dominated battlefields, capable of unleashing hundreds of rounds per minute. Its rapid-fire capability rendered traditional infantry charges suicidal, as lines of advancing soldiers were mowed down with horrific ease. This single invention reshaped battlefield tactics, forcing armies to adopt defensive postures and contributing significantly to the protracted stalemate seen throughout the conflict. The introduction of artillery capable of firing high-explosive shells over extended ranges further exacerbated the lethality. These advancements transformed warfare from a clash of individual valor into a brutal, impersonal struggle of attrition, where sheer firepower and overwhelming force became the deciding factors, irrevocably changing the human cost of conflict. Beyond the machine gun, the chemical weapon entered the battlefield, introducing a new dimension of terror and suffering. Poison gas, initially chlorine and later phosgene and mustard gas, was deployed with devastating effect, causing agonizing deaths, blindness, and lifelong respiratory damage to those who survived. Its psychological impact was equally profound, instilling a deep fear and uncertainty among troops. In response to the increasingly static and deadly trench warfare, new offensive technologies emerged, most notably the tank. These armored vehicles, initially cumbersome and unreliable, offered a solution to breaking through entrenched lines, capable of traversing difficult terrain and shrugging off small arms fire. While their early deployment was limited, their potential was undeniable, foreshadowing the mechanized warfare that would define future conflicts. These technological leaps, though disparate in their application, collectively contributed to the unprecedented casualties of World War I, marking a stark and brutal departure from previous eras of warfare. The Western Front, a 400-mile stretch of land from the Swiss border to the North Sea, became synonymous with a new and horrifying form of combat: trench warfare. This static, fortified labyrinth of ditches, dugouts, and barbed wire quickly turned the battlefield into a brutal stalemate. Soldiers lived and fought in these cramped, muddy, and disease-ridden trenches for months, even years, at a time. The initial hopes for a quick, decisive victory evaporated as both sides dug in, creating an impassable barrier of defenses. Every inch of ground gained or lost was paid for an unimaginable human cost, epitomized by battles like Verdun and the Somme, where hundreds of thousands of lives were sacrificed for minimal tactical advantage. The constant threat of enemy fire, the pervasive smell of death, and the ever-present psychological toll transformed the lives of those on the front lines, creating a generation deeply scarred by the horrors they endured. Life in the trenches was a relentless struggle against not only the enemy but also the elements. Soldiers faced freezing winters, sweltering summers, and constant rainfall that turned the trenches into quagmires of mud. Disease ran rampant, with trench foot, dysentery, and typhus claiming more lives than enemy bullets in some instances. The psychological trauma was equally profound, as sustained exposure to shelling, sniper fire, and the sight of fallen comrades led to widespread cases of shell shock, a term coined to describe the severe combat-related stress. Attempts to break the stalemate often resulted in over-the-top charges, where waves of soldiers would emerge from their trenches into a hail of machine gun fire, leading to staggering casualties with little to no strategic gain. This brutal reality of trench warfare solidified its place as the defining and most tragic characteristic of the Western Front, ultimately contributing to the immense human suffering that became a hallmark of World War I. But the war wasn't just in Europe. It spanned the globe. In the Middle East, Lawrence of Arabia fought alongside Arab tribes against the Ottoman Empire. In Africa and Asia, colonial troops fought for empires that ruled them. In the Pacific, Japan seized German islands. 1915 brought disaster for the Allies, the failed Gallipoli campaign, where Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, faced brutal losses on Turkish shores. The war reached the seas, too. Germany's U-boats hunted Allied ships, including the passenger liner Lusitania, whose sinking in 1915 shocked the world. By 1917, Europe was bleeding. In Russia, hardship and hunger sparked revolution. The Tsar was overthrown, and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power, promising peace. They signed a treaty with Germany and exited the war. That same year, a new player entered, the United States. Angered by submarine attacks and eager to make the world safe for democracy, America joined the Allies. Fresh troops, supplies, and optimism surged across the Atlantic. President Woodrow Wilson said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." By 1918, Germany was collapsing. Its people were starving, soldiers exhausted, allies crumbling. The Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, pushing German lines back. In November, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and Germany sought peace. At 11 a.m., November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. After 4 years, 16 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians alike. The war to end all wars. Didn't. Europe was shattered. Empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, German, all collapsed. New nations were born: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. And in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany, imposed crushing reparations, and redrew borders. It was meant to bring peace. Instead, it planted the seeds of resentment that would grow into World War II. Beyond the immediate disintegration of empires, the war fundamentally altered the global balance of power. European dominance, while not entirely eradicated, was significantly diminished. The immense human and economic cost of the conflict crippled the European powers, creating a vacuum that was increasingly filled by the United States. America's late entry into the war, coupled with its industrial capacity and relatively untouched infrastructure, positioned it as a rising global superpower. Furthermore, the war ignited nationalist sentiments in colonized territories around the world. Soldiers from Africa, Asia, and other non-European regions fought and died for their colonial masters, often returning home with a renewed sense of their own identity and a growing demand for self-determination. This burgeoning anti-colonial sentiment would eventually lead to independence movements across the globe, fundamentally challenging the existing imperial structures and paving the way for a more multipolar world. The war, therefore, was not just a European conflict. It was a global cataclysm that set in motion a chain of events and transformations that would continue to unfold for the remainder of the century, laying the groundwork for a completely new international order and, unfortunately, setting the stage for even greater future conflicts. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, officially brought an end to the First World War. This monumental agreement was intended to establish lasting peace, but its severe terms imposed on Germany ultimately sowed the seeds for future conflicts. Germany was compelled to accept sole responsibility for the war, an admission known as the War Guilt Clause, which fueled deep resentment among its populace. The treaty also dictated significant territorial concessions, including the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France, the loss of its overseas colonies, and the demilitarization of the Rhineland. Furthermore, Germany's military was drastically reduced, and it was burdened with astronomical reparations payments to the Allied powers, intended to cover the costs of war damages. These punitive measures, while satisfying the desire for retribution among some Allied nations, created an environment of economic hardship and national humiliation in Germany, fostering a sense of grievance that would be exploited by extremist political movements in the years to come. These harsh conditions, particularly the crushing reparations and territorial losses, created immense economic instability and political unrest within Germany. The nascent Weimar Republic, already fragile, struggled to cope with the economic downturn and widespread public anger over the treaty. Hyperinflation and social upheaval became rampant, further eroding public trust in democratic institutions. Meanwhile, other nations were also dissatisfied with aspects of the treaty. Italy felt it had not received sufficient territorial gains promised by the Allies, and Japan's proposals for racial equality clauses were rejected, contributing to a growing sense of injustice among these powers. The League of Nations, established by the treaty to promote international cooperation and prevent future wars, ultimately proved ineffective without the full participation of all major global powers and the ability to enforce its decisions. The cumulative effect of these unresolved grievances and the perceived unfairness of the Versailles settlement created fertile ground for resurgent nationalism, militarism, and ultimately, the outbreak of an even more devastating global conflict just 2 decades later. World War I reshaped humanity, politically, socially, and emotionally. It was the dawn of the modern world, and a warning about what happens when pride and power go unchecked. World War I didn't just end empires, it ended an age of innocence. This is History in 10 Minutes, where the past comes alive.